Okay, so this week's lesson is going to focus on physiological psychology. This is going to be the last lesson of the first half of the course, and this lesson will really finalize everything that came before the official founding of psychology as a science. When I say official founding, I'm talking about when universities began to have psychology departments and began to recognize psychological research as distinct and different from philosophy and other types of biological science. So the physiological psychology really does deal a lot with biology. It's the view of the biology of the brain and the nervous system and trying to understand how the activities of the brain and nervous system work to produce thought and behavior. So that's mostly what this week's lesson is going to focus on, and this is really what set the stage for the start of scientific psychology. So let's first start with some early physiological views of what the mind was and how it worked and how it interacted with the body. So we've kind of been going chronologically in the course so far, but with these early views, I'm going to start way back again in ancient Greece and kind of just give a really brief and general background of some different perspectives people had on how the mind actually existed and worked within the body over the course of history up until around the 18th or 19th century. So Hippocrates, 2,500 years ago, was actually pretty far ahead of his time in viewing the brain as the location of emotions and judgment and thought, and that seems pretty obvious to us today, but back in ancient Greece, this was a pretty bold and progressive stance on the source of emotions and thought and psychology as we think about it. Aristotle himself did not agree with this. Aristotle's view was that the brain just exists to cool the blood. It's basically, it functions as a thermal regulation. It cools the blood, but that the mind existed in the heart, according to Aristotle. The early Christian church took somewhat of a complex view. According to the early Christian church, the spirits are what controlled behavior and thought and movement and all these things. So their view was that, one, that nutrients were absorbed in the intestine, so we probably wouldn't disagree with that today, passed on to the liver, which we know today actually filters impurities and toxins out of the blood. But the early Christian church view was that the nutrients got passed to the liver and that the liver converted these nutrients to what they called natural spirit. So this was kind of like the starting point of the spirits. That the natural spirit then traveled in the blood to the heart and was converted to vital spirit. Vital spirit, according to the Christian church, is what allowed things to be alive. So without vital spirit, you aren't living. Then, at the base of the brain, the vital spirit was converted to animal spirit, which is what allowed for behavior, and it was stored in the ventricles of the brain. So if you remember from Psych 100, the ventricles are these kind of fluid-filled tubes in the brain. They're not actually brain matter, they're fluid, but we do know that they have something to do with schizophrenia, so ventricles tend to be enlarged in people who have schizophrenia. This probably restricts the growth in other parts of the brain and may cause some of the issues associated with schizophrenia. But anyway, in the early Christian church, basically people had a knowledge of the fact that the ventricles existed and that they contained some fluid, and so the theory was that this animal spirit, which was required for motion and thinking and basic behavior, was stored in the ventricles, and it was a limited, finite substance that had to be replenished in order for people to continue to behave and to think and to go about their lives. So that was the theory of the early Christian church. So when we get to the Renaissance, we generally get some consensus on the view that psychology occurs in the brain. Still not maybe some some accurate views on how that occurs, but we at least get the location narrowed down to the brain. So Da Vinci felt that sensory information, so bringing sensory information and organizing that into some view or some experience of the world, of the sights, sounds, smells, touches, tastes that we experience, that occurred in the brain. And that reason occurred in the brain, and specifically he felt that this occurred in what he called the middle ventricle. And so again, still a focus on ventricles, and Da Vinci was really looking at where the different nerves from sensory organs came in and came together, and saw that those tended to occur around the middle of the brain, near what he felt was a middle ventricle, which really there isn't a middle ventricle. There's one big ventricle on either side, and it kind of runs laterally down the brain. But so this is based on early dissection and early biological models of the humans, of the human body. And so Da Vinci felt that there was a middle ventricle, and that's where a lot of this happened. And then he located a third ventricle, or what he called a third ventricle, which was more in the rear of the brain, and that's where he felt that memories were stored. Right? So even though it's inaccurate, I think what's important is we're starting to see people that are trying to locate where different aspects of psychology occur, which is a very big step if you want to understand how psychology functions and how the brain is involved in psychology. Descartes, and we talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, held a hydraulic model of the nervous system. And so this is probably largely based on the fact that hydraulics were a new and emerging science of his time. This is how a lot of modern hydraulics were a big advancement in engineering in the 1600s, and so to apply that to the brain was kind of saying, well, now we understand so much more about how hydraulics can work in nature, and maybe that's how the brain works as well, right? So we tend to view the brain and the body in terms of what we understand about the physical world, and this is no different. So in Descartes' hydraulic view, he felt that there were hollow tubes, so he knew from dissections that nerves existed. He didn't really have a great sense of what they were, but to him, they were hollow tubes, and that fluids could pass through these hollow tubes and lead to empty bladders, which he saw as the muscles. So nerves do lead to muscles. Nerves are not hollow tubes, and muscles are not empty bladders. But he was making this connection and trying to say, well, so how does one influence the other? How do nerves influence muscles? So his view was that the nerves lead to these muscles, and that nerves contain threads that are hooked up to sensory receptors in the brain. So sensory receptors being receptors from the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, taste buds, right? So we sense information from the outside world, and that causes, in Descartes' model, a release of animal spirits. So we're still talking about the early Christian church view of having animal spirits in the brain. So that caused animal spirits to flow through the nerves, these hollow tubes, and connect to the muscles and inflate them and cause movement, right? So from an engineering standpoint, pretty advanced and complex model. Didn't turn out to be correct, but again, the important part here is that Descartes is developing a model of the brain that is trying to explain how sensory information from the world can cause changes in behavior, right? So how does that influence behavior? So this is a very deterministic view. Even though Descartes wasn't totally deterministic, it's a very deterministic view of human behavior when he's saying that basically sensory information causes these spirits to flow through the nerves and inflate or deflate muscles, and so those create movement. That means that movement is largely based on the things that you encounter in your environment and with your senses. So much more of a deterministic view. It leaves a lot less room for willpower and free will than prior models probably would have. And so later we see physiological scientists, people more coming from a medical background, that are discovering reflexes. So Robert Witt, Marshall Hall, these individuals discovered that if you stimulate certain areas of the spine, it causes muscle reflexes without necessarily having anything to do with the brain. We figured out that if you shine bright light on a pupil, the pupil automatically constricts to reduce the amount of light flow into the eye, right? These are reflexes that people don't have control over. We don't have voluntary control. So that led to a distinction between voluntary and involuntary movement. Prior to then, people felt that pretty much all movement was voluntary, and that there was no movement that happened without some sort of volition or will. But we're starting to understand, according to these investigations, that there are some reflexes that are out of voluntary control. So because of this, by the end of the 18th century, we started to discard Descartes' hydraulic model, and what took its place was an electric model of the nervous system. And we largely accept this now, but at the time, an electric model was something that was just as far out there and just as preposterous and potentially dangerous an idea as we would probably view a hydraulic model today, right? It just seemed incredible and beyond comprehension that the body could potentially work based on electricity, and that the nervous system was an electrical system. But we started to find more support for that, and so that model was developed by the end of the 1700s or the end of the 18th century. So let's talk about how we got there, how we got to this view of the body being influenced, or behavior being influenced by electrical signals. So what you probably, the general notion of what you were probably taught in elementary school at a rudimentary level about how we discovered electricity and how we figured out it worked, was that some stormy night Benjamin Franklin was flying a kite with a key attached to it. It got struck by lightning. He was able to capture electricity, and we had this very basic understanding of what electricity was from that point on. And eventually, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and the rest is history. We harness electricity, and we have a full understanding of how to use it in everyday life. Right? So what really happened was, in the early 1600s, there were a lot of physicists. So physics was becoming an emerging science at the time. So a lot of English and Italian physicists were starting to conduct experiments to really understand electricity better. They were building rudimentary batteries, trying to develop an idea of how current flowed from positively charged to negatively charged substances. And in some of this work, they found out that there was a relationship between organic biological tissue and electrical current. In a nutshell, what they found out is if you hooked up frogs' legs to an electrical current, the frogs' legs would move and twitch and would contract and expand based on the current flowing through them. So this indicated that biological tissue was a conductor of electricity, which meant that maybe that's how movement and behavior and biological muscle tissue worked, was that electricity needed to pass through them in order for it to move, right? So that led researchers to start studying the nervous system in terms of electrical conduction more and more closely. So Hermann Ludwig von Helmholtz is probably one of the most prominent researchers when it comes to the study of electricity and potentially the study of perception. A lot of scientists at the time, his contemporaries, considered him to be potentially one of the greatest scientists of all time, stacking him up against Copernicus and Galileo and Einstein and whoever else that you want to talk about. You don't hear about Helmholtz as much, but he had a lot of very important discoveries. So one of the most important for psychology, and a physiological psychology, is that he was one of the first to measure the speed of a nerve impulse. Right? So when you probably heard about this in Psych 100, but when we talk about a nerve impulse, when a neuron receives input from other neurons, it causes a nerve, at some point the inputs exceed a threshold, it causes the nerve to fire. What that means is that there's a host of positively charged potassium ions outside of the nerve and negatively charged sodium ions within the nerve, and there's a change in the distribution of these positive and negative ions, and that change perpetuates itself down the nerve. That's essentially an electrical signal that travels from the inputs to the outputs of a neuron, right? And at the end of the day, that's what causes muscles to move. That's what causes changes in brain chemistry. That's the entire way that the nervous system functions. But it's important to note that that doesn't happen instantaneously. It's fast, but there is a speed to the rate at which signals travel down nerves. Helmholtz's teacher and mentor, Johannes Müller, who was a very prominent scientist as well, had a couple different estimates. One of them was that the speed of an impulse down a nerve traveled at about 150 feet per second, which was not that far off. And then he also had another estimate that was 57 trillion, over 57 trillion feet per second. So that would be faster than the speed of light, which we know today nothing travels faster than the speed of light, right? So he had these wildly different estimates for the speed of a nerve impulse. One was in the ballpark, the other one was way out there, right? Helmholtz actually conducted some experiments and demonstrated that the speed of a nerve impulse is closer to about 90 feet per second, right? Which, traveling 90 feet in 1 second is still pretty fast, but it's limited, right? It's not ridiculously fast. It's definitely not instantaneous. And so if you want to kind of get a sense of how fast that is, Helmholtz gave an example in terms of a blue whale. So a blue whale is a massive creature, right? And he said that a whale probably feels a wound near its tail in about 1 second, meaning it's about 90 feet from the whale's tail to the whale's brain. And then it requires another second for that whale to send back orders to its tail to defend itself, right? So it takes 2 seconds between the time an injury might occur in a whale's tail and when the whale can actually respond to that injury, right? 2 seconds is definitely not instantaneous. And for bigger animals, that time is going to be longer because of the speed that nerve impulse has to travel before things happen. So the importance of this is not necessarily to say how fast should reaction time be, but it's important to note that reactions do take time. Psychology does take time. Behavior does take time. And so anything which requires the electrical responses to travel through the nervous system in order to produce behavior or to produce thought, there's going to be a time constraint on that that's based on the amount of time it takes for signals to travel down the axon of a neuron, right, and pass on to other neurons and so on and so forth. So the longer the distance, the longer that behavior is going to take. And so this has implications for all of human behavior, all of our perception, right? Because all of our perception is based on nerves firing and generating certain patterns of brain activity that correspond to our perceptions of the world. So even when we talk about something like sight and smells and hearing and things that we experience instantaneously, they don't happen instantaneously. They take time, and they take time because it takes time for nerve signals to be passed from our sense organs, our eyes, our nose, our ears, our mouth, our skin, to the brain, and for the brain to do all the calculations to determine what it is that we're actually perceiving. So this is really complex, and it's hard to throw exact estimates on it, and it differs for different types of senses. But if we just talk about our visual experience of the world, there's good ballpark estimates to say visually we probably tend to experience the world about a half a second after it actually happens, right? We don't experience a delay because our entire sensory perception is at least that far behind, right? But it's interesting to think about that the things that we see actually occurred about half a second before we actually perceive them, right? So there's a little lag time in between when things actually happen in the world and when we actually perceive that they happen. So that's all based on the fact that nerve impulses take time. All right, so let's talk about a couple of Helmholtz's other major contributions to psychology. These are all in the area of perception. Helmholtz had a lot to do with our theory of color vision, so it wasn't just his theory alone. It's called the Young-Helmholtz theory, or it's also called the trichromatic theory. But what Young and Helmholtz noted was that there's 3 different receptor types in the eye that are sensitive to different color frequencies. So the 3 frequencies, red, green, and violet, in that these receptors are going to be activated when they come into contact with these 3 different color frequencies, and they're going to be activated to a different extent based on the frequencies that are hitting the eye. And so they, instead of calling these sensory neurons, they called these fibers in the back of the eye. But they noted that our perception of color depends on different stimulations or different combinations of stimulations of these fibers. So pretty similar to our theories of color vision today, noting that different sensory neurons in the eye, so different types of cone cells in the eye, are sensitive to different types of colors, and when these fire in different patterns, that's going to produce the sensation of different it's going to produce the perception of different colors based on what light frequencies our eyes are encountering, right? So this was one early contribution to psychology that Helmholtz made. A second big one is the theory of auditory sensation. We call this today the place theory of pitch perception. So in the ear, we have the basilar membrane. It's this kind of, it looks like a snail. It's kind of coiled up. But what you'll notice about the basilar membrane is that on one end, it's a little wider than it is more towards the middle, right? And you've got nerve fibers that kind of stretch across the basilar membrane throughout this whole coil, right? So that means that some of the nerve fibers at the wider end are longer, some of the nerve fibers at the shorter end are shorter, or at the inner end are shorter. And Helmholtz proposed that when we encounter different frequencies, when the air pressure changes in our ear in correspondence with some sound vibrations that are happening in the environment, it is going to vibrate the nerves at a specific place in this membrane that corresponds to the frequency of those vibrations, right? So lower sounds are going to produce vibrations in the shorter ends here, and that higher sounds are going to produce vibrations in the longer ends, right? And so the theory is that depending on which nerve fibers are vibrating, which is going to depend on the pitch of the vibration or the pitch of the sound, that's going to activate a different set of neurons that are going to then tell your brain that you're hearing a different pitch, right? So depending on which nerve cells vibrates, you're going to experience or perceive that pitch to be different. And later studies conducted by George von Bessky confirmed this theory. Von Bessky actually won the Nobel Prize for that discovery. So this is a really early and important contribution to psychology, because it demonstrated that we can sense and perceive the outside world, especially in terms of our visual sense and our auditory sense, because of the way that different nerves are stimulated by stimuli in our environment. So there's a debate, and I don't bring this up because the debate itself is necessarily really important. It's important. Everything I tell you is important, but it's because it illustrates a point about the types of disagreements that people were having at the time and still have today. So the Helmholtz-Hering debate is about space perception. So how do we perceive distance? And we've talked about this a little bit before in class. Specifically, how can we perceive depth and distance and space when the light that hits the nerve cells or the sensory receptors in the back of our eye, in the retina, that's a two-dimensional space. It's a flat surface, right? It's not like some of those nerve cells are closer to the things that are being stimulated and some of them are further away. We just get light projected on a flat surface, so how do we end up understanding what's further away and what's closer? Helmholtz said that perception of distance is learned through experience. This is consistent with the British empiricist view that we talked about earlier, that we learn that when one object covers up another object, it's closer to us than the object that's being covered up. We learn that as things get further away, they appear smaller. They leave a smaller image on the back of our eye. And so things that are smaller tend to be further away. And we learn that when something is closer, our eyes are more crossed when we look at them, so that we can use that information about the angle of our eyes to understand a little bit more about how far away or close things are. But we learn those through time. We're not born with those. This theory is influential to Wilhelm Wundt and the early German studies of consciousness. So the first, what typically gets noted as the first official experimental lab in psychology, they followed in the Helmholtz theory of this debate. Ewald-Hering, on the other hand, proposed that different points on the retina correspond to height, width, and depth. So his theory is still consistent with the fact that perceiving anything visually requires sensory neurons in the eye to be stimulated. He's just saying that there are different neurons that, when they're stimulated, give us the sense of height, width, depth, and so that's what leads to our perception of a three-dimensional world. All right, so this is not based on learning. It's a nativist view. Nativist meaning that we're born with an understanding of depth, and this would have to be the case because if you're according to this theory, you're born with these different neurons, these neurons that can sense height, width, and depth. And so if you're born with those, then you innately have a sense of depth, or you have knowledge of depth that you're born with. It's not like the idea itself is something that's born in you, but if there are different sensory neurons in the eye that correspond to height, width, and depth, then that would be something that you're born with and not something that you have to learn. This theory was consistent with Immanuel Kant and his notion that there are some things, some faculties of the brain that are native, that we are born with. This is highly influential for Gestalt psychology, which kind of argued against Wundt's early German psychological lab. Gestaltists were German as well, but they disagreed with a lot of the work that Wundt did on consciousness. Hering, just a tidbit, Hering also proposed opponent process theory. Opponent process theory is the notion that when we perceive color, actively perceiving one color leads us to restrict our perception of a corresponding other color. And so a lot of you have probably seen this demonstrated where if you stare at a picture of an American flag but with the colors black, green, and yellow, if you stare at that for like a minute and then you stare at a white wall, you'll actually see an after image of a red, white, and blue American flag. And so that's demonstrating opponent process theory, that when you're staring at that when you're staring at the black, green, and yellow flag, that perception of black, green, and yellow is actually restricting your view of red, white, and blue. And so when you look away and you look at a white wall, you see this after image where your sensory neurons for those three colors that are being restricted were firing kind of in response to your vision of the other colors, of the black, green, and yellow colors, right? So Hering made some important contributions to our understanding of color perception as well. So important to note here, we have a lot more evidence supporting Helmholtz's view that perception of distance is learned. We don't have any evidence of having specific sensory neurons in the eye that tell us about width, height, and depth. There are sensory neurons that tell us about other things, like when we see an edge, and when we see movement and things like that. So there are some sensory neurons in the eye that we can say give us a nativist understanding of some of our vision, color, movement, shape, but width, height, and depth is not one of them. All right, so that's something that we're pretty certain today that we have to learn. Okay, so to this point, we've been talking specifically about how nerves can function to give us perception. Specifically, we've talked about light and sound perception. Another important development in physiological psychology that's been really highly influential to modern psychology is an idea of localization of function. Right? So one of the major questions in the 1800s, in the 19th century, is whether specific areas of the nervous system are responsible for specific functions, right? Or is the brain and the nervous system more of an all-purpose machine, right? Can any part of the brain, can any part of the nervous system be engaged for any type of thinking or any type of behavior? So localizationists would say no, that specific parts of the brain serve specific functions. Non-localizationists would say no, any part of the brain can kind of function to do anything we need it to. So a couple of discoveries that weigh in on this debate. One is the Bell-Megendie law, which this law gives us evidence that there's two different types of neurons. We have sensory neurons and we have motor neurons. Sensory neurons are neurons that take sensory information from the environment, pass those to the brain. So these are largely involved with perception of sight, sound, touch, taste, smells. And then motor neurons actually start in the brain and go out to our organs and limbs, and they produce movement, right? And so this means that there is actually different localization of certain functions. It's not that any nerves can be recruited for sensation or perception. We have certain nerves, a certain set of nerves that are for sensation. They bring information into the brain. We have other neurons that are for movement. Their action of these nerves start in the brain, and the brain stimulates these nerves to produce movement, right? And the way it's going to sound cruel, we recognize this as cruel today, but the experiments where people discovered this were animal experiments where they would cut a sensory neuron and they would find out that the animal could no longer had sensation in the limb, the arm or the leg where the sensory neuron was cut, but could still move it perfectly normally. They just had no sensation. Basically, the limb was numb. On the other hand, if you cut a motor neuron, they still had plenty of sensation, could still experience pain and touch, but couldn't move the limb at all. So that demonstrated there was a difference between sensory and motor neurons. We also have what's called the doctrine of specific nerve energies. This is very similar to what we talked about with Kant's phenomena and noumena. So the doctrine of specific nerve energies, so this is proposed by Johannes Müller, who was Helmholtz's mentor, that we're only aware of the activity in our nerves, not the external world itself. So in and of itself, that statement is not really much different from what Kant was saying, that we're only aware of our perceptions, but we have no ability to be aware of the noumena, of the real world things that cause those perceptions. However, there's a little bit more of a physiological twist to what Müller was saying and observing, that the sensations that we experience are independent of how a nerve is stimulated. So the nerves in your eye produce visual sensations, right? But it doesn't require visual information or contact with visual information in order to stimulate those nerves. Any stimulation of the nerves of the eye will produce visual sensations. You can demonstrate this to yourself if you do it very gently by closing your eye and pressing really lightly on the side of your eyeball, and you'll note that you do have a visual sensation of different colors that kind of appears even though your eyes are closed, because you are stimulating those neurons. Again, don't do that very hard, don't injure yourself, but stimulate. When you press on the side of your eyeball really lightly, you're stimulating the nerves in the eye, not through visual information, but it does produce a visual experience. So this is consistent with this doctrine of specific nerve energies that Müller produced. that says that it doesn't matter how the nerves are stimulated, but it's the stimulation of the nerves themselves that produces our perception of the world. And so however those nerves end up being stimulated, that's what's going to produce the perception. It also is supportive of a localization of function theory, because it shows that you're going to have visual sensations when nerves from your eye or visual nerves are stimulated. You're not going to have visual sensations when other parts of nerves from your ears or nerves from your olfactory bulb in your nose or any of those are stimulated, right? You're only going to get visual sensation from the optic nerve. And so that is a localized function that really it acts to produce visual sensations and nothing else. Okay, so the next topic to discuss is phrenology. So this is pretty different, but it matters in terms of this localization of function debate. So Franz Joseph Gall was a German researcher who developed the field of phrenology back in the late early 1800s. We could say that phrenology was early cognitive neuroscience. So cognitive neuroscience is the field of study today that seeks to investigate how different areas of the brain are associated with different types of thinking. So cognitions about different types of things, whether we're talking about language or whether we're talking about memory or whether we're talking about attitudes or opinions or whatever, right? So cognitive neuroscience tries to understand the specific areas of the brain that are responsible for different types of functions. So phrenology is, at a very general level, doing the same thing. So phrenology is this field of study that Gall developed where he would feel the bumps on a person's head and try to determine what that said about their intelligence, their personality, the behaviors that they were likely to engage in. His theory was that bumps or raised areas indicated a higher level of or a higher dedication of the brain to whatever that area of the skull was associated with. And a divot or a lowered area meant that there was a deficiency in whatever that area was. Right? So after studying a bunch of different people, Gall developed a map that said that he kind of localized different functions to different areas of the skull and of the brain, and then he would go around feeling people's heads and say that, okay, well, since this area is raised, maybe you're more aggressive, and since this area is a little lower, maybe it means you're not as intelligent or whatever, right? The overall theory here was that Gall proposed that the brain is the organ of the soul, that the different faculties, so again, we're to this idea of faculty psychology, so different areas of the brain are associated with specific types of faculties or functions. He found that there was a correlation, a positive correlation between brain complexity and chain of being, which means that if you look between species of animals that had bigger brains and more developed brains and more complex brains tended to be able to do more things, engage in different types of behavior, more complex behaviors, and you could say more human-like behaviors, compared to animals that had smaller, less complex brains. There was also, he noted that within species, brains that were more complex were associated with more complex behavior than brains that were less complex. And so this was not necessarily associated with humans, but in his investigations of other non-human animals, he would look within a single species and say, okay, well, this animal during its life was highly active, was able to outsmart other animals, and he looked at his brain, and the brain was a little bit more developed and more complexly organized compared to other animals that maybe got outsmarted more often or were less able to find food or less able to solve problems, things like that, right? A lot of these ideas were consistent with early Scottish common sense philosophy, right? So we talked about that a couple weeks ago. Thomas Reid, Dugald Stewart which were they were proposing that the brain had specific faculties that were responsible for interpreting the world in different ways or in specific ways. And so Gall's work was consistent with that. He was really trying to identify the areas of the brain in humans eventually that were associated with different types of activities. He was trying to do this by saying which areas of the brain were raised and lowered, and did that correspond to greater abilities or lesser abilities in those areas. We know today that this is completely bunk, right? There's nothing to this theory. You can't feel a person's skull and figure out how intelligent they are or how nice they're going to be or anything else about their intellect or brain functioning. You can't do it. So the question is, if phrenology is basically BS, why is it important to the history of psychology? Well, even though it was wrong, it led to some important developments. So Gall's studies were nativistic, meaning that it was his theory, the backing theory of phrenology, is that specific areas of the brain are responsible for specific types of knowledge, right? And he advanced this theory. His theory became popular enough that people were willing to accept that, even if they didn't accept his methods for how to find that. And so today we still investigate the brain with the assumption that specific areas of the brain are responsible for specific types of behavior. His studies were materialistic, so he was really considering biology, the biology of the brain itself, and the complexity of its organization in terms of what produced behavior. He had no magic potions or anything like that. There was no non-material or immaterial stuff that he was proposing produced psychology. He was assuming it was all done in the brain. It was behavioristic, which meant that he could observe things in the real world, observe behaviors, and see how those correlated with the different areas of the brain, and whether or not he could tell that activity in one part of the brain was associated with a specific type of behavior, right? So it gave a different method for studying behavior and studying psychology, as opposed to introspection, as opposed to just telling people what they were thinking. And importantly, it was one of the first theories in psychology that focused on individual differences, trying to understand why maybe humans were different from other animals, and why some humans were different from some other humans, and why some animals were different from some other animals within their species, and trying to explain those through differences in the brain, right? And so that's a really important step for understanding behavior, right? Because he's not trying to explain that through souls or spirits or anything that was immaterial. He's really trying to understand how that worked based on differences in the brain itself. So even though phrenology was wrong, and it ended up turning into kind of what we would call a pseudoscience, where people were trying to, you could compare it to reading people's palms, right, or telling somebody their fortune. They're trying to convince people they could tell them about their life or their abilities just by feeling their skull, which you can't do. So it kind of went off in a non-psychological direction. But it still spread the ideas that were important to psychology to a larger audience, and that's why it's important in the history of psychology. Along the same time, we also were able to learn a lot from brain damage, so this told us a lot about localization of function as well. So the first set of studies that we'll talk about, again, are going to come across as very cruel. So Pierre Flourens did what he developed a method of what he called ablation. Ablation is removing specific parts of the brains of animals in surgery, right? So he would go in, he would remove a part of the brain of an animal, and then he would, quote-unquote, help them recover, get them back to health, even though they had a missing part of their brain. And then he would try to determine whether, after losing a certain part of their brain, did they lose specific functions. And so what he found was that animals without cerebral lobes lost the ability to control movements and to perceive things, right? They were still alive, they could still do other things, but they could not control their movements or perceive other objects. Animals who had their cerebellum removed were not able to move in a coordinated way. They could move voluntarily, but they couldn't coordinate the actions of their movements with one another. They could kind of do one thing at a time, but they couldn't put those movements together in any specific way. Animals who had their corpora quadrigemina removed lost the ability to see. It had nothing to do with taking out the occipital lobe, which is largely involved in visual perception. So he demonstrated that there was a certain area of the brain that was just associated with vision. And animals who had their medulla oblongata removed died immediately. Right? So again, kind of some cruel stuff. But at the end of the day, we learned that damaging certain parts of the brain corresponded to specific types of injuries and specific types of loss of function, while leaving other types of function largely unchanged. There's another interesting case study that you may have heard of before, the case of Phineas Gage. So he was a railroad worker, and he was injured on the job. He was trying to pack an explosive, and it went off early in this tamping rod, which is kind of a long, narrow rod. Got blasted up through his cheek and out the top of his skull, right? Crazy injury. But Phineas Gage he really almost never lost conscious. The account of the story was that he sat up almost immediately and just tried to remove this rod from his head. He made a pretty full recovery from a health standpoint. But interestingly, so he had damage in the left prefrontal cortex, and so what he found is that even though his health fully recovered, he had pretty permanent psychological damage, or not even psychological damage so much as an altered personality for the rest of his life. He lost the ability to make rational decisions for himself, so he could really just not plan anymore. He kind of lived in the moment from that point on. He had a really hard time controlling his emotions. And so what this demonstrates is that that specific part of the brain that was damaged through this accident led to him having these deficits in the ability to make decisions and control emotions. A lot of these things that we consider to be very higher functions that are pretty human-specific and require a lot of complex and planned action, right? And we view these things as voluntary and effortful. But at the end of the day, when there's brain damage and significant brain damage to these areas, we've got evidence that people lose the ability to do that, and no amount of retraining or will or desire those abilities can't be recovered. And so, again, this supports the notion that specific functions are localized in certain parts of the brain. Phineas Gage didn't develop other difficulties or other problems psychologically. He was largely unchanged in most other areas of his mental life, but his emotional life and his decision-making life was largely affected because of this accident to a specific area of his brain. We've also got some studies around this time that demonstrated that language functionality is located in specific parts of the brain. So you may have heard of Broca's area. It's an area in the left frontal lobe of the brain, and it's associated with specifically producing language, right? So not with understanding language, but with creating language and producing speech. And so Broca had, for a really short time, had this patient referred to him who died of an infection. He didn't die because of any research or anything like that, but he died of an infection shortly after Broca. He was referred to Broca, and they did an autopsy after he died, and they discovered that this one specific area of the brain, which is now called Broca's area, had a lesion in it. It had a scar. It was damaged. And this patient, for about 20 years prior to being referred to Broca, had specific difficulty with speaking. All he could say was the word tan. So so a lot of times you'll hear that the patient was referred to as Tan, even though that was not his name. But that's the only thing he could say. He could understand language. He could understand when other people were speaking to him. He could follow instructions fine, but he couldn't. The only word that he could say was Tan in response, and it was frustrating, and it was really hard on him, and nobody really understood what was going on. But Broca discovered that this area of his brain was damaged in the autopsy after he died. And follow-up studies confirmed that damage to that specific area of the brain specifically inhibits people's ability to produce language. That's why it's called Broca's area. There's also Wernicke's area, named after Carl Wernicke. And so what he found, a different area of the brain, the top portion of the left temporal lobe, so the left area of the brain kind of above your ear, led to what's called receptive aphasia. So that means that people had a really reduced inability to understand language that was spoken to them, and they would speak, but their speech would be very meaningless. They would just combine words that didn't go together or just make nonsense kind of syllables, even though kind of they could function normally in other ways. And so, again, this is one more study that supports the notion that localization of function, that specific areas of the brain are responsible for specific types of tasks, specifically associated with language. And even that the difference between, there's a difference between the area of the brain that's associated with speaking and the area of the brain associated with comprehension, right? So Broca's area and Wernicke's area are very different areas of the brain, and they do different things when it comes to language. All right, we're going to finish up here talking about psychophysics. So psychophysics is investigations of the way that we connect the physical world to the psychological world. So how do we interpret the physical world via our psychology? Ernst Weber was a really important psychophysicist. His work was largely associated with touch sensation. He came up with what was called the 2-point threshold and the just noticeable difference. The 2-point threshold talks about how if you're stimulating 2 points, let's say on your arm or on your leg, and so there's a little device that he came up with that had like 2 pins on it, and so put those 2 pins a certain distance apart, and you'll feel when you touch those to the arm or touch those to the leg or touch those to different parts of the body, you'll feel 2 pricks, two pin pricks, right? And you can keep putting those pins closer and closer together, and at some point you're only going to perceive one pin, right? Even though there's actually 2 of them there. At some point the distance becomes so small that you only perceive 1 pin. And the interesting thing is the distance that leads to you perceiving only 1 pin as compared to 2 is different on different parts of your body. So in parts of your body where you have a lot more sensory neurons in your skin, so like in your hands and in your feet and in your face, you can get really close with those pins before you'll only perceive them as 1. They can be pretty close together and you'll still perceive 2 pins. But you look at other areas like maybe your back, and those pins can be a lot further apart and you'll still only perceive 1 pin. That's because there are fewer sensory neurons in that area to pick up the differences in those signals, right? Just noticeable difference, on the other hand, is the notion that there are certain types of pressure that will allow you to notice that something is heavier or lighter, right? So there's different ratios where if you're holding a 5-pound weight, you'll have to add so many ounces before you'll perceive that it's a different weight, right, between your 2 hands. The amount of weight, like let's say you were really strong and you're holding a 50-pound weight though, you'll have to add a lot more weight in absolute terms in order to perceive that there's more weight that's been added there, right? So it's what's called this just noticeable difference. And this kind of threshold applies to all of our senses. So that applies to noticing that a sound has become louder or softer. It applies to noticing whether light has become brighter or darker. So in a lot of these different areas, there are thresholds for noticing the difference between 2 things. It's not an absolute type of value. Also have a guy by the name of Gustav Theodor Fechner. Fechner came up with what we call Fechner's law. So as the intensity of a physical stimulus increases, the intensity of the sensation changes, but that change gets smaller and smaller. So what this graph is depicting as, if there's a stimulus intensity, let's say you start out and something really just kind of brushes your skin, and then you get a little bit of a harder brush, a little bit of a harder brush, a little bit of a harder brush, you're going to notice the difference in those sensations there. So this is pretty related to the just noticeable difference. But if you get smacked on the hand, it's going to take a much harder smack for you to say that, yeah, that was definitely a harder feeling than the one before, or was lighter than the one before, right? So as the intensity gets greater and greater, you need more and more intensity in order to notice that there's a difference between the two, right? So again, this is understanding that there are differences in how we perceive the world around us. So to summarize, there was a lot of work done in the 18th and 19th centuries that were really starting to bridge the gap between the structure and the function of the brain and the nervous system and our perceptions of the world around us. So the big thing I hope you noticed going through this chapter is we're no longer kind of talking about ideas that are just floating around in the mind and we don't really understand how those work or how they're represented. A lot of this early physiological work really started to come up with theories about how information of the outside world affects our brain, affects our nervous system, and causes differences that then lead to our perceptions. So it's important to note that this supported a much more materialist view of the mind, right? So we're really interested here in how the biology works to produce psychology. It didn't end the debate on whether the mind is the materialist versus non-materialist debates, and whether or not there's more than just biology in the mind. So those debates kept going on, but we understood that a lot more of psychology is really based in biology, is based in the physical world and followed physical rules. There were new debates that started up because of that. So it was kind of like, okay, now we understand that the mind is tied to the brain's physical structure, but these other debates popped up, like is the brain, can it kind of do anything in any part of the brain? Does thinking kind of involve just the whole brain, and that can happen wherever, or are there specific areas that have specific responsibilities when it comes to psychological and behavioral functioning? And so that debate got going. There's a lot of evidence that functioning is localized in the brain, but that was a big topic of discussion for some time. So the work demonstrated there is a physical link between the brain and behavior. And importantly, even though some of these theories like phrenology ended up being wrong, we started to develop new methods for studying and measuring the functions of the brain. We started to understand that we could do more than just ask people to report their thoughts, and we could measure what the brain is doing. So a lot of the work that we've talked about in this lecture is highly related to the current work in neuroscience. So neuroscience today is still trying to do a lot to understand what different areas of the brain do, how those areas function, how information gets passed between different areas of the brain, how that all works, right? We still have a lot to learn there, but this early work was highly related to that and really got that ball rolling. At the same time, it was really the final link that set the stage for psychology to be its own science. And after the first exam, in the second half of the class, we're really going to start talking about that work that's been done since psychology was founded as a science. But this work in physiology was really provided the impetus for developing psychology as its own science from the end of the 18th century, from the end of the 19th century to today. All right, that's everything. Definitely contact me with questions. Otherwise, have a great week.